Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital in manufacturing. Derek Needing joins Jonathan Scott and Jen Farello today to unpack this question. My reseller sold me software. Now what? Mind you, we are not dissing our resellers, quite the contrary. This conversation lays out what buyers can expect when purchasing technology in the reseller channels. All resellers are not equal and play different roles. Do they perform the implementation, or are they just selling software? Do you know what questions to ask when you're in a buy cycle with a reseller? You will after you listen to this podcast. Tune in with our team who have been on both sides of this equation to help you prepare for a good relationship with your reseller. Let's tune in with the team.
Welcome back to Stay Sharp. I am Jen Farello, and I am joined here today with my colleague, Jonathan Scott.
Hey, everybody.
And a special guest to be named later. As a reminder, our podcast is about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. And our topic today is getting started with PLM. We've teasingly called it, My Reseller Sold Me PLM Software, Now What? Realizing this could sound a little bit irreverent. After all, some of our best friends are resellers. And in fact,
some of us were resellers
right,
at some point.
Some of you were resellers. And I'm sure some of them are listening in now. So this is not about bad resellers. This is about the reality that the folks involved in the implementation are generally not the same folks that made the decision to purchase the PLM system in the beginning. They've been, to use some quotes, handed a box, basically, and told to go. Their job is to make a success of it, and our job today here is to help with that. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Derek. Derek is the VP of Sales here at Razorleaf and has the honor of being employee number 2 after our CEO and founder, Eric Dubell, who's on some of our other podcasts. He's been in lots of situations like this. And in fact, I think he can start us off with a personal experience about being the one handed the responsibility of achieving success. So Derek, can you give our listeners who haven't met you a little bit of background on who you are?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Thanks, Jonathan, for having me. So I was in this situation. So I'll go back a little bit before that. I started my professional career after school in mechanical design. I worked for a medical devices company, and my role was in the respiratory group. So that was nebulizers, oxygen concentrators, liquid oxygen delivery systems. So I did mechanical design and engineering in there, and I enjoyed it. What I found I really liked, though, is to try to help do things better and faster with our processes. So oftentimes I would find myself leveraging things like Visual Basic or VBA or Access or those sort of things to write some tools to try to help us with engineering change tracking or batch printing or those sort of things. And I really enjoyed that. And that kind of got me into more of the IT side of the engineering group. So I became a bit of an IT liaison within the engineering group. And we were making the switch to solid modeling, and we had selected SolidWorks. And so one day after we bought SolidWorks and we were in our implementation, my boss came into my office and he put a box on my desk and said, you need to figure out what this is. And I said, what is it? And he said, I don't know, but the people that told us the SolidWorks said we need this stuff. And so that's what it was. It was Smart Team PDM for managing our SolidWorks. And so I started to dig into it, try to figure out what it was, and we began a Smart Team implementation. And shortly after that, I realized I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of stuff I liked before. You got the process side of things. You got to know how people were designing and manufacturing products. But then I got to look at the tools that helped with them. And so we were implementing Smart Team. And as you mentioned, some of us were resellers. I went over and started working at a reseller of Smart Team and SolidWorks, and did that for a few years. And that's where I met Eric Dubell. And when Eric started Razorleaf, he asked me to come over. And so I went over and started working at Razorleaf. At Razorleaf, I've had a number of different jobs. Of course, in the early days, did everything. I think I even maybe authored our first website. And, we did a little bit of everything, mostly on the consulting side. That was most of my role. So about 8 or 9 years ago, I moved into the sales group at Razorleaf. And I found that I really liked that. That kind of took me back to my roots, which was talking to our clients and our prospects and finding out what they did, what their process challenges were, and then looking at how we could use technology and put the process with technology and try to make it better for them. And so I really enjoy doing that. And today I help run our sales organization and set the strategy for what we're going to go after and how we're going to do that. and I really enjoy it. And it's what I've been doing for a long time, and it's something that way back from the days of being handed a box and saying, figure out what this needs to do. Basically, that's what I'm doing today, except other people are handed the box, and then I help them figure out what they need to do.
Derek, that's great. I never realized how much of our origin stories getting into this we had in common. But that's awesome, because I had a similar story about being handed a box, and it was related to, oh, you've got SolidWorks, now you need this too. And, that's to Jen's point earlier. I think a lot of times resellers have some very good insight about, well, if you're going to do this, then you need to do this, and this is going to help you get where you need to go. And yeah, there might be a few things to connect the dots, but your reseller certainly, just like mine did, they knew what they were talking about. You're going to need some data management if you're going to do 3D CAD.
Right.
And I'm just laughing at the back in the day when people were handed boxes.
Right. Software came in a box, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, we're all dating ourselves.
Absolutely. That was good background, Derek. I appreciate you bringing that up, particularly some of the pieces about the things that you enjoy, because I think that's a perfect segue to a lot of things that we want to talk about today, right? Related to, this is more than a software thing, right?
And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, right? It's one of the things I mentioned is that the people making the decision to purchase PLM software are not necessarily the people, and most times are not the people responsible for making it a success. So there might be, even like getting started, there might be a disparity between what was it purchased for and what is it really going to be doing.
Right. I mean, it's a perfect place to start is the who, right, Jen? Who is responsible for implementing PLM software? If you assume that it got purchased, right? And what do you see, Derek? I mean, you run into lots of our customers. Is it always one group, a couple of different groups? What happens there?
Well, in the scenario that we often see is it's actually just like what you and I talked about, Jonathan, is that someone has purchased a CAD, switched to a new CAD software, and whether it was because of a promotion or because the reseller was trying to set them up and make sure that they had the right tools, they end up with these tools. And so the answer to your question, I think, about who is involved in this, often it's that team that was around the CAD selection. So it's the engineering folks are the ones that are then asked to do this. Sometimes they're even the ones that do the initial implementations. Now, as we start to grow into bigger systems, bigger PLM systems, maybe it starts to get outside of that. But I think the answer to that is that often it's the engineers that are the ones that are first tasked with figuring out what should we do with this.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I see even more variety than that sometimes. Like I've seen the box getting handed not to the engineering team, but to the IT team, right? And that's a really interesting situation when like somebody in IT is like, you want to put what in place? We didn't even know you were looking at that, right? We didn't even know that was a thing. And it's, oh yeah, we need some servers in the data center, and we need this, or and these days, or we need some cloud instances that we got to spin up. And well, what are you trying to do? Hold on, and that can be the start of some of the confusion, which is why it's good we're talking about this today, because depending on where you start, like what problem were you solving, might tell you a bit about who's already involved and then who needs to be involved.
Well, that's right. And I think that's the fundamental that it needs to go back to. So whoever is handed the box, engineering or IT, someone needs to say, what are we trying to accomplish?
Right. Why?
And it could be very simple. It could be CAD file management, check in, check out, revision control. That's what we're trying to accomplish. And if that's the case, that's fine. Let's now go through the steps to enable that. But
PDM kind of stuff, right?
PDM kind of stuff. But what if that isn't the case? What if what we're trying to accomplish, the reason that we were sold the software was because we articulated a vision that was bigger than check in, check out? And in that case, then we have to begin to build that plan, and we have to start to figure out what is it we want to do? What's our success criteria? What order do we want to do it in? All those things. Right.
Something that was maybe more PLM-ish than PDM-ish, right? Like, I'm having an issue with bills of material and authoring bills of material, and my Excel isn't cutting anymore. And that's a different problem. Or, you know what? Change management. We're doing it in email, and that's terrible. So we got to do that. So maybe it's a process thing, right? Or some other capability. It could be any number of things, to your point.
Yeah, and I think in this scenario, we're talking about that someone didn't do an exhaustive study of the PLM vendors out there and the competitors and compare their requirements. So we're assuming that they were given PDM, PLM, a tool independent of those other things. So I think that is a good place to start, is what are we trying to do? What are our problems? And how does this tool line up with our problems?
Right.
Because it can sometimes be the case that a process problem is not looking for a tool to fix it. It's looking for process changes to fix it.
Right.
And I use the phrase a lot of times with our prospects and our clients that if you've got a bad process, putting a tool in place to automate that just automates a bad process.
Right. Just makes it faster.
Just makes it faster, which isn't always good. Getting bad stuff done faster can sometimes be a problem.
I don't know that we call that efficiency, right?
Yeah, getting your bad stuff done slowly might actually be saving you money. So I think that is a good place to start, is to kind of go back to say, okay, what are we trying to accomplish, and where, what do we need to fix? We talk often about things like current state and future state. How do we do it today? Where are the gaps? Where are the problems? Where are the slowdowns? How would we like to do it? And then when we see that difference between current state and future state, we can start to look at the technology and look at what options it has and see where it can start to get us from current state to future state.
But to your point, you got to understand what problem you're trying to solve first, right? Otherwise, are you even solving the right thing?
Yeah, exactly. And do you have the right tool? And
right.
maybe the tool is the right tool, but do you have the right licenses? Do you have the right features enabled? Do you have the right integrations available? Because if we're trying to solve stuff and maybe we just have the out-of-the-box tool, we don't have some of the options, those are all things that we have to consider.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is spot on. And I've seen it plenty of times on projects that we've worked on, that sometimes at the beginning of something like this, you can get steps out of order. It doesn't mean that any of them are wrong, right? You might have done exactly the right step. You just forgot a couple of steps leading up to it. Or sometimes maybe you just got lucky and you did the right thing. You didn't know why, but you did the right thing. And now it's like, okay, before I go a whole lot further, let me get my house in order, right? Let me make sure everything is clear. Okay, I've got this software tool. The reseller did a great job of making sure it's a good fit for me and it's what I need and it's going to help me. Okay, but before I start trying to put it in place, what else do I need to have ready before I go, right? And there's probably a handful of things we need to think about getting ready.
That's right.
So is it almost more like a going through the requirements review again? Is it taking a look at, because to your point, I think a lot of resellers are responding to what their customers are asking for. Hey, I have this problem. Here's a tool that you can use to fix it, without necessarily saying, okay, is it the process or is it a new product that you need? So is it to go, basically is the first step to go sit back down and say, okay, now you've got this. What are you trying to solve? And does that present you with an opportunity to pull in some other groups and say, and are we doing the right things? Are we using the right processes? What does this new tool that we now have that could assist us in other areas?
I think you're exactly right, Jen. I think it goes back to something we've talked about in the past, which is when you're implementing tools like these, generally there are some, we'll call them low-hanging fruit. The things you want to do first, the most important things, the easy things. But often there's other future things, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 stuff that you want to do. And I think you're making maybe a bit of a mistake if you don't consider those all up front. So we've talked about this before. It's not that you have to do everything in phase 1, but wouldn't it be nice to know what our goals in phase 2, 3, and beyond are going to be, so that when we do the things in phase 1, we do them in a way that's conducive to growing into phase 2 and 3. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that's kind of where you got to start, is step back and say, what are we trying to accomplish? What are our objectives? Priority on the objectives. Maybe there's some timing things you need to consider, the way your business runs, or the IT windows that are available to you. There's potentially timing things, and then you start to build that plan, and that plan will be probably fairly detailed for the early phase, and maybe a little less detailed with a little bit of ambiguity, things yet to be defined for some of the later phases.
You mentioned something else interesting there, Derek, that I think is also important, right? And this is something that I know I've seen plenty over my career, is the softer things that you need to pay attention to. Like, did I get all the right people involved? right? We talked a second ago about, well, who gets handed the box, IT or engineering, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's one piece. But let's talk about the other things that you mentioned. Something you might do in phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 4 down the road. I mean, with a lot of these PLM tools, it's not just about engineering, right? So it's, in a later phase, I'm going to hand off my bill of material to my ERP or to the manufacturing group, or I'm going to get quality documents in the system, or you might be thinking about other groups. And I think you bring up a really important point. When you're getting ready here at the beginning, make sure that you've got the right people involved, right? If you're going to change how the organization is going to work or do something or use a tool, are you ready for that? And are they ready for that? Or are you just getting ready to tell them, hey, here's a new tool, you should use it?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good point too. It's not just the tool, right? It's the people around it. Like, are they ready? That's a big thing. Are they ready at each stage? Do they understand the value of what this is bringing to them and to their role and to other people's role, to the company as a whole, as well as are they ready for the changes that may require? Mm-hmm. And then further downstream, when you're planning out, like, and how are you going to train people? And how are you going to get them ready for not just the implementation, but actually the using of the new tool?
Yeah. That really gets to that OCM topic that we've talked about before, right? Organizational change management. And organizational change management, some people confuse it with, we're ready to go live, let's train people.
Right. Yeah. And it's not just that, right? No. I mean, it's so much more.
It's part of it, but it's not just that. You actually should be planning your training in your organizational change management way back at that requirements gathering step.
Right. Well, and you're even doing it when you ask the question, who should be involved? Who am I impacting? Right? I'm getting ready to put this tool in place and we're going to start doing bills of material in it. Well, wait a minute. Did you think about all the people who need bills of material? Oh, well, I should talk to them first, right? I mean, even for just the simple reason of maybe they just bought a tool to solve the problem from their side. Oh, well, now how are we going to interface or what I think that is, you have to think about that stuff early.
Well, and people will do their job better and will be on board with the process and the changes more if they understand the whys.
And if they're involved.
If they're involved, that's right. I've been in organizations where they made a large system change, a new ERP system, something like that. And you say to someone that's a user of that system, how's the new system? And they're like, I mean, I guess it works. I don't really know. I mean, they told me I have to push this button, and so I push it, and I don't know what it does, and I don't know why I have to push it. And nobody really understands why. And so it's hard for them to be excited about it. It's hard for them to look for opportunities to improve or to change or offer suggestions if they don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. So to get them involved and to plan how we're going to communicate and how we're going to train and how we're going to bring people up to speed, it's only going to benefit us in the future.
Yeah. And speaking as myself from 25, 30 years ago, right, when I was in that mindset of, well, we're putting this in place, of course everybody knows why we're doing it. Right? I mean, that's a mistake. It's a rookie mistake. I made that plenty of times, when I was trying to put PDM in place. And, people are like, well, I just want to get the files off my hard drive. Why do I have to do this? And I'm like, come on, you know why. But if you don't take the time to involve the people, like you just said, and help everybody understand it, get aligned, lots of people poo-poo that, but it's really important.
Yep. Let me offer another class of people that should be involved in some of those early discussions. So Jonathan, you mentioned a lot of the people within the organization, different departments and different people within the organization. What about people outside the organization? So, your reseller that sold you it probably can help a lot with what are the capabilities and what are the things you can do with it. So there's one option. Or if you're talking about integrating with other systems, are there experts in that field that can tell you your options and how you do that? So the contractors, the consultants, the resellers, those are all people that maybe you want to have a voice as you start to plan some of this out.
So I think all of that's great, but we're talking about getting ready, right? The things you need to do and thinking about the why and the what are you trying to do and who does it involve and all those kinds of things. Another one that comes to my mind is rarely are people doing this totally greenfield. Oh, I'm starting a brand new company. I'm gonna get some tools, that kind of thing. What's the stuff that's laying around the existing, foundation that you need to think about? There are things there you got to consider, right?
Jonathan, we've been in business for 24 years. And in those 24 years, we've had one greenfield customer that was a brand new startup. They were making, I think, some optical thing for the military, and they're a brand new startup. They had no legacy data, and it was great. One in 24 years. So that's a good point, because you're going to have legacy data. Even in the case, think about this, even in the case we're talking about, like my story, right? We were handed SolidWorks and the PDM system together. So our legacy data wasn't parametric CAD files, because those didn't exist yet. We were going to start doing them along with our PDM system. But we had decades of 2D files, of scan drawings, of Excel bills of material. That's legacy data. If we want this PDM system to be a representation of our products and bills of materials and searchable, do we only care about files created from this date forward? Probably not. You probably care about that stuff too. So you do have to now consider that legacy data and how we're going to deal with it. What is it?
Yep.
What options do we have for bringing it into the system or accessing it from the system? Definitely.
Or do we need to? That's a decision too. Like, it's, is that data that we're still reusing, or do we just need to file it in a vault somewhere and make sure it's safe?
Yeah, actually, and the safe point brings up another interesting thing when you're thinking about getting ready. Okay, old data that's safe and new data you might create that you need to keep safe. What does keep safe mean for you, right? Because it's easy to take that box that somebody hands you, because I remember this. So I worked in the nuclear industry. It's easy to take it and just put it in place and say, look, it's on a file server, it's working, it's great. It's a different thing to say, oh, somebody in my organization knows that there are special rules around here about how we manage data, what we do with data, how long we have to retain data, how we have to secure our data. And, like our DoD and defense customers know this very well. Lots of regulated industries understand this very well. But that's another one to think about when you're getting ready. Where are you going to put it? How do you have to secure it? Are there any special rules that you need to follow while you're getting ready to put this software in place? Because your reseller understands the software and probably the business problem you're trying to solve, but they may not have known all the nuances of how your business operates and the unique constraints that come up there. So I think that's another important one to think about.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think another one that I would offer when it comes to the legacy data is the older the company and the more legacy data they have, the more inconsistency that might exist. So we talked earlier about
quality
doing kind of what's that?
The quality of data.
The quality of data. That's right. We talked earlier about doing a little bit of a requirements gathering session on your processes, trying to figure out what processes you want to implement and how you want to do them, and maybe some improvement. What about your data? There needs to be some analysis of your data and the consistency of your data. We talked about what data is out there, but also now, how are we going to get it in? Do we have duplicates out there? If we didn't have a system before, maybe there's duplicate files out there. We need to consider that. Are there inconsistencies? So when we go to bring all of our data in, we're going to plug the part number in this field and the description in this field. Oh, that's right. Back in the 60s, we didn't track, description in our green screen system. So now what? Yeah,
I think you're right. All that you have to consider. It's part of that foundation, right, of what exists that you need to consider before you're putting something in place. I will say we got to keep moving. There's more to think about here. There's more to talk about than just getting ready.
We haven't even moved off the dime here.
But I got one that we can't forget while we're still getting ready, because to me it gets right to you're starting to implement and you're thinking about things. One other thing to get ready is, what's the system behind the system, right? This is one that comes up more and more today as we see sort of IT evolve and IT mature and practices mature. But what are you using to manage this process of putting this new tool in place? You bought a tool, but you're going to put it in place. All right. Are you going to track requirements about the tool? Are you going to run tests to make sure that it's working? Are you going to write any customizations or any configurations about it? And that's all the stuff we're going to talk about doing in a minute, right? But where are you going to track all that? Is it emails? Is it file system? And so the term I'll throw out there, because this is kind of a soft spot for me, is DevSecOps. Do you have a plan in mind, whether it's a system, a collection of systems, or just a methodology in mind for how you're going to develop this thing and how then you're going to operate it? And the sec part in the middle is secure, right? How are you going to do all that securely, make sure that it stays secured in the process? But I think you have to think about that when you're getting ready, right? We're not quite doing it yet.
That's a great point. We talked earlier, Jonathan, about figuring out what your requirements were, current state, future state. But we didn't answer the question about where do you put that, right? So if you don't put it in a repository that is somewhat organized and somewhat easy to go back and refer to, let's fast forward a couple of years. It's time for a big upgrade. And we need to make sure that the upgraded version acts the same way. You got use cases? Well, I know we talked about them. I know someone wrote them down somewhere, or it's time in the future to switch to a new platform. You've outgrown the platform you're on. It's time to switch to a new one. What should our new platform do? Well, I know we talked about that one time.
Yeah. Or make it even simpler than that. We put this thing in place and we're going to put a service pack on it. We're going to put a fixed pack or something on it, right? Well, how are we going to test to make sure that worked?
Yeah.
I know we've got some test cases or use cases somewhere, right? They're the ones we did during implementation. How did you hold on to them?
Yeah.
Well,
did you hold on to them?
And I would say not just that, but also you can't be doing that in your work environment, right? You can't be doing it in the environment the folks are working in. You have to have, how many environments do you have? Do you have a development environment? Do you have a test environment? A live environment or a production environment?
Glad you brought that one up, Jen. That's critical.
And sometimes people get confused. Some of these softwares that they're handed they're not handed a box anymore. It's access to a
almost
cloud
never, in fact.
yeah, that's true. But they're handed access to a cloud environment. So your system it's in the cloud. And so sometimes people can think, well, when it's in the cloud, there's really no IT protocols that need to be wrapped around that. That's not so true. You're going to be doing some configuration. So where are you going to test that? And we're not saying testing whether you've done something to make the system unstable. The cloud environment might be very protected, and you really can't do things to crash the system or make it unstable. But you could mess up your process. You could make a field required that doesn't crash the system, but your process doesn't know how to handle that.
Right.
So you still need these other tools, dev environments, test environments, QA environments, to be able to go through that stuff.
Well, and I don't think you can rule out even what you said, Derek, right? I remember years ago working for a medical device manufacturer, and they said, look, we totally trust that what the software was that we were putting in at the time was a different PDM system. They said, we trust that it's tested and it works, but it doesn't change the fact that every upgrade, because we're making medical devices, we have to check to make sure that the data we put in is the same as the data that comes out, right? And whether it's cloud or on-premise or where it is, if you're in a regulated industry, those are the kinds of checks you might have to run.
That's right. Yeah.
But I think, Jen, you bring up a great point, which is think about that in your planning. Just like I mentioned DevSecOps, think about the environments you're going to have. What do you need them for? Do you need them for testing? Do you need them for training? What do you need them for? And you might need multiple cloud environments or on-prem or whatever they are. But it's something to think about when you're planning, because you don't want to get deep into the project and then realize, I have to stop and wait because I don't have what I need.
Well, it's funny. We've spent so much time talking about the planning, which is, I'm very familiar with this. My husband's in home remodeling. It's the whole measure twice, cut once approach. So, but we've spent a significant amount of time up front, and now we need to get moving. So we've defined the number of environments. We've got the licenses we want. We've got our roadmap, if you will. Where do we jump in at this point?
Yeah, it's time to start configuring. Let me even back up. We're assuming we're installed or enabled if it's a cloud environment, right? So all of that's taken care of. Yeah, now it's time to actually implement, to configure, to start to set stuff up. Oh, where did we put that current state versus future state? Because we're going to need that during this time. Goes back to the point you made earlier, Jonathan, right? So now let's start referencing some of the goals that we established and some of the things that we want to do, and to begin to configure the system. And there's probably an education that needs to happen, because a lot of these vendors offer processes and tools out of the box, and they have an engineering change process built right in. Does that work for us? Do we need to configure it? Customize it, maybe change it, write code on top of it. Now, we don't want to do that. We want to stay out of the box. That's the process now that we're going to go through, is to start to figure out, what tools and configurations are we going to use to start to make this mimic the processes that we're trying to have it mimic.
And it goes right back to what you mentioned earlier about, you got to know what you're trying to do, because it could be that you had a process problem. You were trying to solve a process problem. And the idea was, I know that software will help me do that process better because they've got an out-of-the-box process. It's great. It could have been 180 degrees off. We have a real problem with our process. The process we have today is great, but it's very slow and manual and tedious. I don't want what they give me out of the box. I want to use what they give me, and I want to run my process in it. 180 degrees off of each other, right? And if you knew which one you were going for, then this step is executing, right? It's making it happen. If you didn't, you could spend a lot of time arguing about what the point was while you're trying to do this step.
Well, and I don't want to minimize this step, because certainly there's a lot of time that's spent, and frankly, it's pretty important, because if you don't do it right, you can't use the system. But like with anything, Jen, your measure twice, cut once scenario, if the planning was done well and the planning was thorough, this step really should be executing on the script. We know what we wanted to do. We knew what our options are. We know our priority. And now let's go execute on it. And so this goes back to having that good script and making sure we've talked about and thought about and documented those things.
I will say, though, to that point, Derek, you're right. I mean, if you've planned it out well, executing this is pretty straightforward. I think, we take for granted a lot of times, because we've been doing this for years, right? We've been doing these kinds of implementations. We know that there's a blending that needs to happen when you're figuring out how do you configure a system? How do you make it a blend of the process and things like that? That has to happen between somebody that knows the tool, somebody that knows the process, somebody maybe that knows some history, maybe the data, but there are a lot of different things you put together to make this work. And if you don't, this is a mess, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could do a technical implementation that's like, it
Beautiful.
all works. Nothing good.
Yeah. That's a good point, and this goes back to, who you involve in some of those early discussions,
right.
Because, you may have a desire to do such and such in the system. And maybe if you talk to someone who is a consultant or a reseller and they know that system inside and out, they could say, it's a lot harder than you would like. Or we've done that 4 or 5 times, didn't turn out well. Or we've done that 4 or 5 times and it turned out great. Or we had someone else that wanted to do that. We suggested this and that worked out great for them.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't mean that the people that within the company that are implementing are somehow failing or they don't know. That's not their job. They're not experts in that. So let's go talk to some experts and let's learn from their experience and hopefully leverage that experience to make our implementation faster and better.
That's absolutely, I think that's great advice, Derek. I mean, even back at that early stage of getting ready, who are your team of experts, right? And in some cases, maybe not even just the experts, but who's your team, right? Who can you rely on to help you out here? Whether it is that reseller, some other expert, somebody inside your company who went through an implementation at another company that they came from, a student. Oh yeah, we used that back at university. There's lots of people that could help with that process.
Right. That's right.
And I think it's important not to overlook anybody in that, because you're not sure where the answers are going to come from. So it's good. And the more going back to buy-in, the more everyone feels that this is their solution as well, the easier the whole usage of the system is going to be at the end.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's right. Yeah. And then, then what we tend to find when we're in this implementation mode is shortly after we get kind of the base system up and we get, a number of the configurations done and we begin to feel like it's starting to feel like something that we own and our processes, now you start to turn your attention to things like legacy data. We talked about that before, about analyzing that, but now it's time to actually start bringing it into the system. Oftentimes that's a very kind of scripted process. You have to do it maybe over a weekend, or you have to stage it in a way that it comes out of the old system and into the new system because maybe people are actively working on some of this data. So there's a lot to talk about on how that works and when that happens. We find that with a lot of legacy data implementations that you're almost best to follow a process. We call it a rehearsal process. So you kind of, and this goes back to some of those, ancillary systems, the dev and the test systems. So you want to do some trial runs of your legacy data. And so you do rehearsal 1 and you assume everything's going to come in and you find out only 50% of it came in. Why? Oh, we weren't considering this scenario and that's what caused this 50% to get missed. So now let's fix that, whatever that scenario is. We write some scripts or do some transformation that fixes that. And let's do rehearsal 2. 90% of our data came in. And you'll probably get to some point where you're like, that's good, we'll manually fix the rest. And then you can do your live load at some point. But that's generally the process that you're going to go through, something like that, to get your legacy data in the system.
I think there's another point there too, which is you mentioned, you're going to get sort of down the road on configuration, and then at some point you're going to be ready to think about legacy data. That's right, but you're probably going to be doing those two still a bit in parallel, and you shouldn't think about them in silos, because you may find, my legacy data, I used to track this, this, and this. I wasn't thinking about that in the new process, but I don't want to lose it when I bring in the legacy data, or vice versa. The data's not shaped like that, or whatever it might be. But a lot of these things can feed each other, right? The requirements that the users have can feed the configuration of the software. And that might dictate some of the process of how it behaves. But you don't want the process to be quite like that, so then you influence the configuration from that direction. Then you think about the data, and all these things connect in a way that you need to be thinking about that as you go through the process and allow for it, because it helps you get to a better end state.
Yeah. So what this is sounding like then is, it's not, to your point, it's not a parallel process. It's not a serial process. It's not something that just flows from one to another, but it's almost like a series of loops where you're like, okay, you do this. To your point, whether you call it a rehearsal or not, it seems like you almost want to have those rehearsals all along the way, where you're like, okay, we've done this. Let's check and make sure that was what we thought it should be and doesn't need to be improved. Okay, then let's move forward and do that again.
I think you could do it different ways. I mean, I know I've seen people do it different ways, as long as you're remembering that concept, right? That they shouldn't happen in a silo. They could be somewhat serial, but then iterative, or they could be parallel and feed each other. We do a lot of work where there's, agile-like approaches to it. But I think there's, as long as you remember the concept, that's what's critical, I think.
Yeah, Jonathan, I was going to mention the agile approach as well, because we've seen people have some success with that. And one of the things that kind of continuous process, where it's not the big bang, we spent months and months or a long time configuring and implementing, and then we went live on this day and everybody switched over. That can work, but it also has some challenges with it. One of the interesting things about that kind of continuous or agile approach is we get to learn from what we did in the past phase. So, when you're implementing a software like this, you've never had a PLM system, you've never implemented one at a past company, and now you're going to go implement this. We've seen cases where people spend a lot of time with a particular customization or configuration because they know darn well they're going to want that in the new system. And then the new system goes live and they find out
they never use it.
Really didn't need that. If I would have known this is what the system did, I probably wouldn't have even asked for that. So could you do small steps and small chunks and learn from yourself and say, what? Basics. We're going to do this. Mm-hmm. Use all out of the box. We do this, and then after a while we say, all right, we do need to do a little configuration. Some of that out of the box stuff didn't quite work. So let's do a little bit of configuration. And you kind of go through iteratively and do that process.
And I'm going to connect that to take us to another point that I think is important here. As you're getting the system configured and you're doing that iteratively, one of the things you need to be paying attention to is, what is that end state process going to be, right? You mentioned it a couple times already, Derek. Current state versus future state. You may not know exactly what the future state looks like till you start configuring the software. But as you do, you better start zeroing in on it. And I say that for a critical reason. I've done a ton of software training in my career. There's a lot of training out there that is software-based training. Here's what the software does. Here's what the buttons mean. Here's the buttons you click, that kind of thing. That has been much less effective than process-based training, in my experience. If you show somebody how to get something done, right, and that's based on this new process you're going to perform, if you train on that, people understand how to do their jobs. They understand, I used to do this, now I'm going to do that. But if you say, look, you used to do this, and now I want you to use the new tool, here's the guide on what all the buttons mean. They sit there and scratch their heads and go, I'm not sure how to do my job tomorrow, and then the thing doesn't get adopted and you failed.
That's right.
Well, because what you're doing then is you're leaving the process remodeling to them.
Yep.
Yeah. I've been in those training classes. I've conducted those training classes, Jonathan, where I tell someone, here's how you do X, step by step by step. And they say, well, what happens when our vendor did this? And so that means we have to implement this process and it goes sideways because of this thing. And I'm like, I don't know anything about that. I just know what buttons are. But that's a legitimate question, because sometimes in the perfect state, here's the buttons you click. But what happens when the perfect state didn't happen, or there was a hiccup because of something that was unplanned, but it happens in our business? How do you handle that?
Exactly. And not to say there's anything wrong with software-based training, right? Like you said, you've done a number of things like that. I've done a bunch of that. That's got its place, right? That has its place back in we're trying to figure out how to configure, understand how the software works, to know what requirements we have and what we want our process to look like. You needed to know what the button clicks meant. But when it's time to say, all right, we're rolling it out, we've made the process changes, we've done the remodeling, to your point, Jen, and people want to know, how do I use my kitchen? Okay, don't just show me what the buttons work like on the oven. Show me, well, why did we put this here and why is that there? And you see how this works now?
Right.
That's what I need to know, right? And this comes right back to that OCM point we made earlier. What are you trying to accomplish? And are you training people on that objective of what you tried to do in this whole process?
Right. That's right. Yeah. And so then I guess as we continue down that implementation path, I would offer another thing that's important, which is, so now we've got a system in place. Maybe we've loaded our legacy data, and now we're tracking more than we've ever tracked before in an electronic and central format. And what do we do with it? Does that data feed anywhere else? Or does it just sit there? We now are sucking bills of material out of parametric CAD files, and now we have engineering bombs instantly. And those engineering bombs have some relation to a bomb over an ERP, but are we still filling out the paperwork to get that bomb loaded in the ERP? And so integration, right? How are we going to get that data? Or integration the other direction, which is people used to have access to these files because they sat on a file server, and now they don't because they're in a PDM vault. So we need some other integration so people can get to the files from their system over here. So integration is a big consideration. Of course, you should have been talking about it during design and planning, but now it's time to implement and start to talk about how we make these integrations work.
That's right. And hopefully it came up in process, right? Because as you were talking about business process, you said, I don't mean just the click-by-click process in this software. I mean, how do we get things done? Well, first the customer orders something. Well, they do that in System A. All right. And then from that, we know we need to create a product in engineering. Oh, well, that's System B. Oh, okay. Right. I need an integration, right? So that process helped us understand this.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But to Derek's point, hopefully that was talked about during the planning phase. And now we're turning the wheels. We're like, okay, we're getting this done.
Making the details happen behind what we intended to have happen when we were getting ready. Yep.
Continuing the remodeling of the processes.
Right.
Just now we're outside of engineering. So we've got our system up and running. We've got the legacy data in it. It's integrated. We're done.
We're done, right?
Right?
We're done.
All done.
Sweet. Just
all done.
Don't need to talk to our reseller anymore. No more upgrades. Oh wait, I'll bet the vendor keeps working on the software and keeps improving it.
Yeah, and what happens even internally when there's questions? Things, even well planned out process and well implemented systems have hiccups every now and again. What happens there? So,
and you mentioned another point earlier, Derek, which is if you did it incrementally and you did it in phases, let's say we just finished the first part. Well, there's all these other people who want things out of it. There's all these features we didn't do at the first stage, right? So are you ever done?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
Pretty sure it's like repaving the interstate. You're never quite done. As soon as you're done with that, it's time to do the other patch that was done 5 years ago. So
yeah,
and I think that's a great analogy too, because who are you trying to keep happy? Well, as drivers, we're all on the highway all the time. Pothole crops up. All right, we got to solve that. You know what? This road doesn't go where I need it to go anymore. Well, that's a bigger thing to fix, but we still need to solve it. So there's all kinds of issues that come up while you're using the system day to day, and you need a plan for what are you going to do. And I'll say this is another area where I've seen sometimes organizations can struggle with adoption because you don't always think of this step, right? You get to roll out, deployment, training, everybody's trained, we're using it, looks good. And it's like, all right, the team's disbanded, everybody's good. And then, 2 months later, it's like, well, but we never got to that feature, or that doesn't work the way it used to. It's harder in the new system or whatever it is. If there's nobody around listening to go, is it still working for you? Is it still good? Does it solve that problem? If there's nobody there, then you can backslide to, well, let me do it the old way. I like the old way better.
Jonathan, I've often said in a lot of these system implementations that the number one key to success is user acceptance. Mm-hmm. Is it's making sure that the users know why, how, when, and they know how to use the system. So we've got to provide that support channel for them. And we've got to give them an outlet. I mean, imagine you're a user on a new system and you have an error and you call the IT help desk and they're like, we know nothing about that system. We don't support it here. And so now you're walking around the department trying to find somebody that does, and everybody, the guy that they think knows it, he's off to lunch. To your point, Jonathan, you just backslide. And you're like, you know what, I'll just print the bill of material out and hand it to somebody to enter in the system. I'm not going to go through this because you got a job to do. Right. So, that's actually part of the planning that we need to be doing and thinking about is how are we going to support these people to make sure that they have a good experience in using the system, because a good experience in using the system will yield future good experiences. We'll have other people want to get on the system. And now all of a sudden we've got, success breeds success.
That's right. And we can get to the original footprint we planned or the roadmap that we had in mind or whatever it is. But without that kind of sustained attention to what you're doing, you get off the rails. So I think that's a great point.
Yep. And we can even go back to what we talked about earlier about those use cases and test cases and current state and future state documentation. If I had something I could go to refer to say, oh, here's what happens when you see this error, when this process needs to be invoked. If I had something like, a wiki, a OneNote, whatever that I could go refer to, I mean, how great is that we can, have some self-service in there?
Well, and it brings down the total cost of this system, right? So I'm going to speak like the IT guy for a minute and say, lots of folks, when you put a system in place, want to know what's the total cost of owning that thing over time. And your next upgrade is going to cost a whole lot more if you don't sort of maintain the thread, pun intended, between what you did in implementation and what you've done to maintain it and where you are now. If you can follow along and get back to all that stuff, the upgrade's much less expensive, right? But if you have to go recreate it, and maybe the same people weren't there, you don't understand the requirements, you're like, well, at least I know what software licenses we use. Sure. But which parts of it do you use, right?
Right. Right. Well, until those software licenses have been morphed into other software licenses in the new version, and now you got to figure out what processes you do so you know what new software licenses you need.
Absolutely. Plenty to think about there.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I want to make sure that we're kind of watching our listeners' time here, and I know we're running long, as we tend to do on occasion.
That never happens,
when
Jen.
The topic is so informational and so interesting. So I do want to. So it sounds like really, if I was taking lessons away here, it's spend a lot of time. I don't want to say the bulk, but a good chunk of time in the planning, because that's going to save you money and time and effort downstream, and it's also going to create additional buy-in. So spend a lot of time planning, involve the right people, take a look at tool versus process, and then basically just go through the implementation, make sure that you're following, you're checking back in your current state, future state, again, involving the right people, getting the buy-in, and then once it's there, continue involving the right people, providing the support, etc. So, any last things that any particular hot points that I missed there?
That's a great summary.
No, I think you summed it up well, Jen.
All right. Well, then I want to thank you both for joining us today, especially Derek for being our special guest.
Glad you're here, Derek. This is good.
And remind our listeners to reach out to us on social media if there's something that you felt an important point that we missed here. If there's another topic you want us to talk about, reach out, let us know. We want you to be part of the conversation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. We appreciate you. If you have any questions for our podcast team or have an idea for a new topic for our team to cover this year, please send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We would love to hear from you. Also, leave a comment on our post and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay sharp.